Hi there everyone, and welcome to another session in a series of how employment law and HR can save your business. Today we're going to focus on redundancy in particular and what most webinars won't tell you about getting it right. We're not going to focus too much on the process. This is more around the wider considerations and the common pitfalls really that sometimes can get employers into hot water. So I'm Zoe Lidster from Harwood HR Solutions, and I'm joined today by Roy. Hi, Roy.
Hello. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Roy Magara. I'm an employment solicitor at Magara Law. And as Zoe mentioned, we're going to be diving into what most webinars don't tell you about redundancies and getting them right. As you can see on the screen, one of the first things that is important, perhaps just to brush over, broadly speaking, is redundancy and the facts that come into that. So as some of us may know, and some of us may not know, redundancy is one of the 5 fair reasons for dismissals, for a fair dismissal, legally speaking. And one thing that employers need to do, for example, is make sure that they can explore other avenues or alternatives for redundancy. We'll touch on that in a bit more detail. But principally, employers need to make sure that you have a clear rationale and explanations and reasons for the potential redundancies, whether that's in terms of your process, so identifying the right pools, making sure you're using the right criteria in terms of scoring those pools of people. But more so, a couple of the differences that might come around in terms of whether you're making individual redundancies or collective redundancies. So that's where you have 20 or more employees potentially being made redundant within a certain period of time. You need to make sure that you follow through that fair process of having consultations, so meaningful meetings with the employees and looking at any potential other suitable employment for them as you go along to make sure that everything is seen as fair. There are, somewhat unsurprisingly, a number of common pitfalls. So again, the purpose of this webinar isn't to go into what is a redundancy and all of that, but more so other ways to help you. So in terms of looking at the common pitfalls, a number of them, in the most part, are incorrectly identifying the pool for selection. So a business, for example, might be in a scenario where they might want to cut their administrative staff for whatever reason. But instead of focusing on perhaps the right pool of people within a given set amount of skills, they might only pick on an individual. And that's because they might see it as looking at the person as opposed to the role. That's a big no-no. Equally, there might be assumptions regarding alternative job roles, thinking that an individual might not want a specific job role and therefore you just simply don't offer it to them. Equally, there may be a lack of clarity or rationale when it comes to proposing where restructures are supposed to be involved and in terms of how to cut down the size of the business. And we'll be looking at that in a bit more detail later on too. But those, at least in terms of our experience, are some of the scenarios that often come up when looking at pitfalls to businesses. Over to you, Zoe.
Yes, thanks, Roy. I suppose just picking up on the common pitfalls is the first part I was going to start with here around the business case. So actually, one of probably the most important points and considerations for employers is getting the business case for the redundancy situation correct. I think one of the common pitfalls, and I'm sure, Roy, you've probably seen this, is where there's an absence of a genuine reason for redundancy. What are those sort of genuine reasons that we can use? Well, the employer ceases to carry out business in which the employee was employed. So the business is simply shutting down, reason number one. The place of work is closing down perhaps and moving elsewhere, potentially another good reason for redundancy situation. The needs of the business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind ceases or diminishes, or the needs of the business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind in the place where the employee was employed either reduces significantly or diminishes. So it's worth bearing those things in mind really when you're thinking about what is the business case for redundancy. And I would, strongly recommend you focus on some of the facts and figures. If you've got financials to support your case, they're always really good, because they're a good way to explain to the employee why the business is in the situation that they're in, and what effects and that's having on the business, the impact of that, and therefore the need then to potentially remove individuals from the business and reduce costs, essentially, whereby you will then, as you've mentioned, Roy, looking at the pools of individuals you've got, and keep focusing on roles, not individuals, right? So it's always roles, not people. Be transparent as well. So as I said, just provide as much information as you can as to the genuine reason for redundancy. And also make sure that before you press ahead, you've thought about what measures you can take to avoid that situation in the first place, because one of the key rules is, you should have done everything you can ahead of making any announcements of redundancies to, in fact, avoid that situation altogether. So things like looking at, have you got temporary staff that you can cut, stopping of bonus payments, maybe overtime, cutting overtime down, recruitment freezes. Have you got any overheads such as office space that you can look to reduce? Which, I think we'll cover off a little bit later date, but it's certainly very important that you do that from the beginning. Make sure you've taken appropriate measures ahead of making the announcements.
Yeah, quite right. Very much agreed. And delving a bit deeper into the discussion on that, people matter. People are, in many ways, for many employers, the driving force of your business. And in the lifespan of a business, it does happen that there might be occasions where redundancies might need to be made. But let's just focus in a bit more detail as we turn to the next slide, these 2 points, the alternatives to redundancy and the impact of employees who remain. And the reason why we're doing that is because it seems quite often businesses focus simply on the issue at hand, i.e. the redundancy, and think that that is the only option that they have. Whereas we'll come to find that as we journey to the next slide now, that actually there are some other alternatives that you can consider. Now, one of those alternatives that you can consider is flexible working or new working arrangements. You might come to find actually that following discussions with your employees, that your employees would much rather in this context go part-time or have some kind of flexible other working arrangement than be made redundant. They may think, okay, in the short term, it's better for me to work for 3 days a week instead of no days a week, or at least you can actually have that conversation with them. Secondly, you may actually also find that your employees are more willing to take a 20% reduction in their salary, or to not have their bonus for that particular year, than to be made redundant and or lose their job. Because employees might be thinking, okay, I've been here for 20 years, actually I'd quite like to stay here, and I'd much rather be on 20% less, be paid 20% less, than lose my job altogether and take redundancy. Equally, recruitment freezes. You'd be surprised how many businesses still either continue recruiting or end up recruiting to a point that they think actually this is no longer viable or sustainable for the business, and then end up cutting staff, or in many respects, actually, believe it or not, they will keep the new staff and then get rid of those who have been loyal or been with the company for a long amount of time, which then actually can have a negative effect on the company's morale and PR. And that's one thing that companies, at least we should think, ought not to want as far as that's concerned. A number of companies might have agency staff or contractors, say, who do the work. And in those instances, it's much easier to terminate those particular contracts than it is to make your employees redundant. And one simple matter of fact is that the relationship between a business and an agency staff or a contractor is very different to that of an employer and an employee relationship. The emotional tie between the employer and the employer is much closer. It's much closer knitted than it is with an agency staff or a contract, which is much more contractual in nature. Equally, we've got things like sabbaticals or secondments. I appreciate that this option might not be there for all organizations, but certainly it is an option for some, and something which organizations ought to consider, particularly where it's something that's open to them, and where you might have another organization that is happy to have a secondee in this instance, and to pay the salary for that secondee as well. That immediately then releases you as a business who may be thinking of needing to make redundancies from that sort of financial obligation to that individual for a certain amount of time. Lastly, we're looking at redeployment to other parts of the business. So instead of making just focusing on one department and not looking at the bigger picture of your organization, it might be the case that you've got individuals who might be a positive influence or be able to make a positive difference in other parts of your business where you may have gaps. And that's where the discussion around having conversations rather about alternative suitable employment, and not just assuming or presuming that an employee may not be willing to take on something which might on the face of it could be completely different elsewhere than to what they're doing now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Roy.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that was a really good point actually, because when you don't just assume, it's the same with, we've got another site but it's 50 miles away. Well, the employees, no one's going to want to relocate there. Well, we don't know that actually. Don't just assume, give them the options, because you might just find, actually they'd be more than happy to, and a move is something they've been thinking about for a while. You just don't know. And it's the same with, as you said, flexible working actually might work really well for somebody. So job sharing, those things can kind of come up, which people would quite like, but maybe they haven't really either thought about properly, or perhaps they've thought if they've put in a request for this type of working before, it wouldn't be accepted, so they haven't done that. So don't just assume is definitely a really good point.
Yes, quite right. And just picking up on the bit that you mentioned about flexible working or home working, etc. One thing that I think that growing times have shown us is that IT and infrastructures around IT have really grown, and businesses are able to adapt and cut costs where there's free premises, and allowing their employees to work more flexibly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's definitely something that should be the forefront of people's minds at the moment. What can you do to remove those big costs? And often building is a big cost. Or can you reduce some of that size of that? Do you need less office space now? Can you have more of a hot desk type situation where people don't have to be in every day? Really good point.
Yes, thank you.
What about would you say probation periods? Now, for me, that's always one that's worth looking at, as a first start, along with the temps, contractors, people on probation. How do you feel about looking at those as a first instance and saying, well, actually, they've only been with us a couple of months, they've got another month to the end of their probation, we don't have the work for them that we thought, providing obviously they're in the same sort of pool and as everybody else. But for me, that would always be a first sort of plan of attack as well, is to look at, well, are there people that we can fairly remove now from the business? What would you say in your approach to that?
Yeah, indeed. That makes complete sense. I'm with you on that. The reality is probation is there for both the employer and the employee to figure out, is this the right fit? Is the future going to make sense for both of us? And if it happens to be during this period of time that there isn't a business need for the individual, for the employer or employees who are on probation, then it would make sense commercially, legally, and indeed fairly to look at them indeed the right pool, the right criteria, etc., all in mind first.
Yeah, because it can feel a little bit unfair that well, just because I'm on probation, then I'm just picked. But I think it's looking at the wider piece there and making the right decisions for all of the employees.
Yeah, I'm certainly with you on that, Zoe.
Yeah, sorry, I think I cut in on you. Are we good to move to the next section?
At all. Yes, please. Let's journey through. So once we kind of think about the situation where employees might have to leave, a lot of businesses, Zoe and I find in practice, are that just seems to be it, and then it's business as usual moving forward from that. Whereas actually, businesses need to take a moment to think about the impact that the whole process has had on the employees who remain. So you may or may not know that for a lot of instances, studies have shown that for the employees who remain, a lot of them feel somewhat disgruntled because of the negative impact that the redundancy process has had. Now, no redundancy process is going to be smelling of roses, but certainly there are ways that we can make things easier, both for those who are leaving, but certainly those who are going to be sticking around and continue to work. In terms of looking at some of the negative impacts, or I suppose what causes the negative impact, businesses need to think about the fact that people are leaving, and in many instances, they're going to be employees who take on an increased workload. And the fact that they have an increased workload, which still needs to be done in the same amount of time, may mean an increase in stress levels. And therefore, it might mean that it might be a disconnect between their ethic, their work ethic, and their involvement with the company. So companies need to be alive to that, and companies need to ensure that their communication to their employees is really on point. So ensuring that the company communicates that they understand that this is a trying time, make sure that the company communicates to their staff that there are avenues if they need to speak with people, that there is, for example, employee assistance, that there are confidential avenues that they can go to just to communicate and de-stress and have conversations about. I mean, on that point, Zoe, before I move on, perhaps being HR and advising companies a lot more closely than I will as an employment lawyer, what are your thoughts on how best companies can communicate to their staff in this regard?
Yeah, well, I mean, communication, just, you know, it is that key word again that comes up often. But yeah, I mean, I would be advising that once, if it's an announcement whereby only a handful of the employee or a portion of the employees affected, doesn't affect everybody, once the announcement's been made to those individuals to tell them that they're at risk of redundancy, your next announcement, if you like, and group of people you should be speaking to are all those people that aren't at risk. Now, sometimes I think people are a bit shocked by that and say, well, we can tell people that we've put people at risk of redundancy. Well, yes, because they need to know. It's really important that you say, you know, unfortunately, this is the situation that's arisen. We've let people know today that they're at risk of redundancy for these reasons. This is the group of people that are affected. So roles, shall we say, not people, I should say, but the group that are affected by this. So they know what those individuals are going through. They can be mindful of that. They can perhaps be supportive of their colleagues, because actually, you know, there might be a lot of upset people, potentially angry people, confusion. So if it's people that they work closely with or in the same environment with, they can just be mindful of what those people are going through. And while you can never say to a group of people, you know, you won't be at risk of redundancy and we're not going to make you redundant at all, you can say, you know, at present you're not affected and there are no plans to make you to put you at risk at this time. Yeah, I think that's another key point. But first of all, let that, you know, that helps settle everyone a little bit, because they go, right, okay, well, we know what's happening now. That wasn't a secret meeting over there that we didn't know about, and now we're all panicking that we're next. We know how the land's lying, and keep that communication going throughout the process. Once it's complete, let everybody know we've now completed the process. You know, again, at present, we don't have any plans to make any further redundancies. However, we'll continue to review the situation and, as always, keep you posted. But just let people know what's happening. You know, when you make the announcement to people that they are at risk of redundancy, I would include in that announcement that we will be speaking to the rest of the staff today to let them know that this is happening. Just be transparent and be open with people.
Yeah, really agreed. And I think once companies learn to do that, it takes care of the second point of this list, which is dealing with any potential distress that might be caused or created, rather, between the employees and the employer. It takes care of any resentment or anger, as it were, that those remaining employees might have. But more so, one thing that perhaps employers need to bear in mind is that everyone deals with this redundancy process differently. You may have those who have what's called survivor guilt, i.e., oh gosh, my good friend or colleague, so-and-so, sat across me for all this time, is now gone. Gosh, and I'm here. And I know that this person is still struggling or can't find work, whatever the case may be. But you might, on the other end of that spectrum, also might have employees who think, goodness, I wish that was me who left. And they might have what's called survivor envy. And so again, it's just about making sure that there are as much as possible one-to-one conversations, but also collective discussions with the remaining employees to make sure that your ship is still riding smoothly through as the storm begins to decrease there. Because what you don't want then is for the decrease to be found in employee involvement, in employee interaction, in employee engagement with the company, because you've just been through one storm. You then don't want to be dealing with others. You want to be trying to move as positively possible in the future as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose this should just carry on from that point, really. But what does the future look like after redundancy? And the importance of actually getting that right as well. So worth planning and thinking about at the outset, actually, about how you're going to manage that, because where it is a situation that, you know, there are a number of employees that remain, there are, you know, many points to consider on this, and the survivor syndrome, as we'll call it now, so which includes the guilt and the envy, you know, it's an emotional reaction that happens when you have a redundancy situation, and it's important to manage that in the right way. You know, we need to make sure that we're looking after those people that, as you've rightly said, might have an increased workload now, because although you know, the redundancy situation will have considered that and know how the work's going to be spread out of that's remaining, it's worth noting down that not everybody's just going to cope with being given something extra to do. Is there any sort of training and guidance they're going to need on this? Do you need to upskill anyone to manage with this? But to just have in mind how those people are coping, you know, with their workload mentally, and being, again, open and honest, having those open conversations to see how people are feeling. What are their concerns? Is there anything that you need to think about? You know, any support that they're going to need? And really kind of sitting down with that group of people that are left and including them in plans for the future. I think that's really important, where you can, if you can share, you know, your vision of what the company's going to look like going forward, and include those remaining staff in that. And, you know, how do you think we should press on with it? Here's a particular issue we've got right now. How do you think we can solve that? Make them part of the decision making, help re-engage them and reignite them a little bit to go, oh, we've still got a business here, it's still exciting, we can build this back up. You know, this was just something that happened on the side. You know, what does it mean for me? Oh, I've got an opportunity here, I might have some extra workload, but is this an opportunity for me to develop and, you know, and progress within the company? And it will really help with the engagement of staff if they think that they're part of the decision making. So, you know, I think that's really an important point to note, and having clear goals about, you know, what does the future look like here, and what we're going to all working towards now, is definitely really important.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think that you've come across when perhaps from the employee perspective, what I'm going to use a really good terminology here, what are their biggest moans when they come to you about why they've been made redundant and they don't think that it was the right thing to have happened?
Yeah, I think certainly it's just a lack of understanding of the process and why or how it could have happened. I think a number of employees just don't understand how one day everything seemed to have been fine, and then all of a sudden they're sat in front of someone who says, "We're really sorry, your job's got to go, you're being made redundant," and that's that. And that, I think, comes down to the communication point on the first end of the spectrum, and then on the other end of the spectrum, the issue is, okay, sort of the point that you just touched on last was, okay, we had redundancies, but then all of a sudden we went from a group of 10 to 3, and actually the workload has pretty much remained the same, but I've taken on X amount of work. And then we end up in a scenario where you have an individual who used to be fine in terms of work, fine in terms of mental health, and by the time they come in front of me, they are stressed. They've been signed off for months. They're on antidepressants. The sleep is all wrong. The appetite is all wrong. The relationships are all broken down because of the stress that's come from work. But then the stress that comes from work then brings on financial concerns, and the financial concerns then bring across relationship concerns, and then it all begins to spiral. Whereas this could potentially have been solved a very long time ago. And so you end up not only dealing with a spate of redundancies, but then companies end up being at risk of potential constructive unfair dismissal claims, which, suffice to say, all companies ought to be looking to avoid. But on that mental health point, Zoe, I wonder whether you seem to be having, or you may not be, seem to be having more and more conversations about mental health and advising, or at least alerting employers to the fact that yes, people matter, but not just to solely think about keeping the business afloat and surviving that, but also ensuring that their employees' mental health is taken care of too.
I think a lot more employers now are very aware of the fact that there is a responsibility and a duty of care to employees to look after mental health, and having the right people in place to provide sort of some coaching and training on that is very worthwhile. I work with a number of partners in the mental health and wellbeing space, and a lot of my clients recently have started working with those people, and the feedback that we've got from employees about how it's really changing their lives both personally and at work has been phenomenal. So there's definitely a space for that, and I think there is more and more awareness of that. But yeah, I would always be advising clients just to think about everyone in the business when we're looking at something like a redundancy situation. And like I said to you previously, communicating to all of the staff the process that we're working through, and how it might be affecting everyone, just so that people can be mindful of that and supportive of their colleagues, but also put their hand up and say, oh, actually I'm not feeling great about this, and can I, is there someone I can speak to? Or just actually just talking it through and feeling there's a door open that they can go and speak to somebody, because actually that also eliminates a lot of those issues that you were talking about, where people feel it's okay to speak out and talk about how they're feeling, or ask questions and get clarity on areas. So I had a redundancy situation recently actually, and the people that were at risk, there were a handful of them that couldn't quite get their head around the justification. They understood that there was a reason. They didn't dispute the reason that the client was looking to make redundancies, but they didn't quite understand where this had come from, because they saw a business that seemed to be doing okay, because they weren't in the sort of the nitty-gritty of the financials. So that employer actually sat down with their staff and did a presentation and took them through exactly how they'd got to where they were. And it probably was one of the smoothest processes in terms of consultations I've ever done, because nobody really had any questions on that. Everyone was quite understanding that I get why we are where we are, and nobody felt that it was unfair in terms of the business case. So yeah, again, that person took it upon themselves to do that presentation, but such a great thing, to do. They took time out, spent time putting it together to help those individuals really understand why they were put at risk of redundancy in the first place.
That's impressive. So good to do.
Yeah, well, and guess what? They didn't have any problems afterwards. So we talk about this stuff, and we've said that we talk about this webinar would be a bit about what you don't usually hear, and that's why we didn't want to focus too much on the process. So hopefully that's really helpful and certainly thought-provoking for everybody. But obviously Roy and I are both here if you need any help at all on the process and detail, conducting it, or just guiding you through, and if you need any advice, then just get in touch with us. Thanks, Roy, good to speak to you again.
And to you, Zoe. Thank you.